It is great to see everybody still talking, socializing, networking. That's amazing. So this is our final day of the Produce By conference. I know. So I'm Michelle Bird. I'm the Associate National Executive Director, and I'm so pleased you've all been here. So thank you. This session is called IPIQ. It's sponsored by Deadline, so we want to thank them. As a courtesy to our speakers, if you could remember to turn off your cell phones, please keep your mask on. You've heard the whole drill over the weekend. The speakers will have their masks off. And it's now there will be questions at the end, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Editor-at-Large from IndieWire, Ann Thompson.
Hello all. So this is my favorite panel because it's the one that I'm going to learn the most from. I love to watch the industry and figure out what's going on, and that's why I want to moderate this panel, because this is what's going on. This is the new world of finding material, finding content, and these people, this extraordinary group, are the ones who are doing it. So please welcome Liz Hanna, Aaron Hart, Barry Jossen, and Jason Richman. So I'm sure you actually do know all these people already, but just in case, Liz Hanna on my left is a triple threat, a writer, a director, and a producer. And she won the Writers Guild Award for Steven Spielberg's The Post, starring Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks, followed by a WGA nomination for David Fincher's Netflix series Mindhunter. And she's the executive producer of two big deal series that are out right now, The Dropout and The Girl from Plainville, for which she directed 2 episodes.
And I'm going to have you introduce me at every event ever for the rest of my life.
As the head of TV and film at Wondery, ex-literary agent Aaron Hart has pushed the development of Wondery's podcasts into film and TV series, serving as executive producer on Dr. Death, Joe Exotic for Peacock, and 2 series for Apple TV, Shrink Next Door and We Crashed. And as president and head of A&E Studios, Barry Jossen oversees all creative programming and business operations of A&E Network's in-house scripted production division. And since the ex-ABC Studios chief joined A&E in 2014, he has produced such series as Hulu's Peabody Award-winning Unreal, the History Channel's Roots, and showrunner David E. Kelley's ABC series Big Sky, as well as 2 Kelly-Michael Connolly collaborations, The Lincoln Lawyer for Netflix and upcoming Avalon for ABC. And I don't know how Jason Richman has time to be here. He rose up from the UTA mailroom to become co-head of UTA's Media Rights Group. His clients include Celeste Ng, Eric Larson, Stacey Abrams, Anderson Cooper, Salman Rushdie, the newspapers, the Boston Globe, of the Los Angeles Times, and then WNYC Studios, and the estates of Ray Bradbury and Norman Mailer. So there's a lot coming from your universe. So we all know where content has traditionally been mined: theater, books, established IP. Barry, you've watched the industry change over the years, and I'm wondering when you saw the shift to moving into all these other areas of finding content. How has it changed from the traditional to what it is now?
So as much as it's changed, things are very much the same. As I was preparing for today, I decided I should look on do some research to find out the origin story of source material for film. And what I learned is that George Méliès, one of the first great filmmaker, used the Brothers Grimm and Shakespeare to make 2 films in, I think, 1899. And even subsequent to that, Thomas Edison at the Edison studio used Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in 1910. So more contemporarily, what's changed is there's just so much more access. There's so much more material, and there's so much more access. It's easier to get to. It's easier to find, and a greater openness to adaptation than I think there's ever been before.
Okay. Jason, you have made a business out of identifying talent and finding talent in places where other people have not. Tell me how why that's your skill and how you employ it.
I mean, I don't think I came down to Hollywood knowing that this job even existed, to be honest. So I started in the mailroom like a lot of people after, thinking that working in an agency was the worst possible route for me. And then 6 months of odd jobs later ended up in UTA's mailroom, and to be honest, found my way. I took a job with an opportunity working for the head of our current department, 12 years ago, I would say. And the test to take the desk was to read a book and go and talk about its prospects for film and TV. And I was as an English major growing up who read a lot and also was a just total cinephile. This was just like music to my ears and just, I guess, came very easily, but didn't know that, getting an English major in college was going to be a path to, figuring out, identifying different forms of intellectual property and how to, bring them to the masses in terms of adaptation. But, I think to go off your first question as well, when I started in our, it's now called the Media Rights Group at UTA. But when I started, it was the book department, and then became book to film. But it became much of a misnomer because, it wasn't just books, it wasn't just feature film. There was a big sea change, I would say probably like 8 years ago maybe, in terms of, the television landscape really optioning a great number of books, both nonfiction and novels, and then it became articles and, podcasts and life story rights and everything in between. And so we had to even, update our department's name just to catch up with the times and make sure that it was a big enough kind of umbrella of the intellectual property landscape that, we feel like has just, is booming and is so vibrant right now, which is keeping all of us busy, but in a really exciting way.
Well, you've been on a tear during the pandemic. I mean, why has I read this 250 deals in the last 12 months alone, including close to 200 since the beginning of the pandemic. Why is?
I mean, that wasn't just me, I would say.
That's the Sicily trip right there.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay.
It's funny, the before times, and the after times, but like the pandemic set in, I was literally on my way, March 2020, had landed in London for the London Book Fair, landed, the fair got canceled literally as we were on the tarmac, and we ran around London still because London was like 2 weeks behind us, but, I flew back to Los Angeles as we were being told to pack up our offices, and we thought it was going to be a week or two, and then we'd be back, and 2 years later, plus years later, here we are. But it was funny. It took probably about a week of getting our bearings working from home, and then I felt like our group moved into overdrive in terms of, everyone across the board was stuck at home. It's like people discovered how to read again, which was really surprising. So everyone picked up that book off their shelf or off their bedside table that they'd been, saying that like, I'll get to that, when I have time, and now they had time. So because of that, it just became this just kind of widespread just excitement across the board of, actors and filmmakers and executives, everyone kind of reading voraciously, which kind of just spurred on this just really wonderful time for our business specifically.
So did it also mean that people were looking farther afield for listening to podcasts on their exercise walks, whatever?
I mean, I think that sea change had already started, to be honest. Wondery's been around for much longer than, just the pandemic time. So, but we're seeing so much of that innovation consistently. It's just for us to be able to catch up with it, and also, be hyper aware of, what's the hot new thing that's going to drop in our lap, which makes the job that I have, that why I love it so much, is every day is, you never know what's going to hit your inbox in the morning, and what you're going to end up reading and falling in love with, and then figuring out how to bring it to life.
So Aaron, let's go to you. When did you figure out that podcasts could actually be a business?
Well, I joined Wondery about 3 years ago, and the company has had phenomenal success in kind of transitioning our podcast into television. To date, we've sold over 20 different projects to studios, networks, and streamers with some of the most prestige showrunners and talent in the business. We've had 4 prestige limited series come out over the last year alone, as the ones you just mentioned. And I think for us, it's really the fortunate thing of being able to identify these phenomenal stories in an audio-first way, but have the ability to really build out these amazing characters and bring you into worlds that you never knew or expected, that are very easily transitioned into other mediums. And that's really like the success that we've been seeing across the board.
So it also means that something can be proven, which is, of course, what everyone wants to see.
I think that's worked really well for us. The fact that we do these prestige limited kind of prestige miniseries podcasts, which tend to be about 6 episodes, and they're broken down into 3 different acts or things like that. But essentially, we've had the pleasure of working with just these phenomenal showrunners who are able to take what is in the podcast and figure out how to transition it. And, from the true nonfiction stories that we've been doing, people have really kind of kept them as true to life as possible, and something like The Shrink Next Door, that was a story that spread over a 27-year period of time, and there are moments in the podcast that, go for one little act, but are be able to build out into like a larger episode in television.
So it's a good way to feed these series, which are hard to feed, to keep enough material going for a whole multi-episode arc.
100%. And I think one thing that we've also noticed as well is, we're fortunate to, on the Wondery side, we work with on our team are the best producers in the business, the best storytellers in the business. And these podcasts take about 6 to 9 months a year to produce and are a total undertaking. And we realize that we have built in so much underlying research that doesn't even go into the podcast, that becomes so valuable as people step into these new mediums and things like that.
So Liz, this is where you step in, because the trick here is, how do you take these raw materials, and even if they're very developed, and turn them into something visual that works on television?
Well, I think a massive part of what Aaron just said is that there's usually, even on a podcast that runs for a certain amount of time, there's so much material that gets left behind because you can't put it into 6 hours. And similar with an article, with The Girl from Plainville, it's based on Jesse Barron's article in Esquire, and Jesse had thousands of pages of research that couldn't go into a 10,000 word piece. And with The Dropout, Rebecca Jarvis and her team had a number of sources or avenues that they had looked at that just didn't make it into the podcast. So the first step for me is obviously listening or consuming whatever it is that I'm adapting, but then it's talking to the primary source, talking to the person who has presented this material, and finding out, my first question is always like, what didn't make it? What didn't make it on the podcast, or what didn't make it in the article? And with Plainville, both Aaron Lee Carr, who did the documentary I Love You Now Die, and Jesse are consulting producers on the show. And for both of them, Michelle Carter's interior life was something that had been missing. And more of Lynn Roy, which there's a lot of Lynn Roy in the documentary, and there's a lot of Lynn Roy in the article, but Lynn is, I think, for many of us, the heart of the piece and the heart of the story. And so that was really a jumping off point for Patrick McManus, who's my co-showrunner, who also show-ran Dr. Death. We don't have to clap because he's not here. It's fine. He's fine. But I think it's really, it's about collaboration. I think being a showrunner, being the person who's adapting this incredible material, it's both a privilege, but it's a huge responsibility, and the undertaking is not something that should be done alone. And it's as you just said, going to a visual medium. I'm a writer, and then I'm a director, and I can't operate the camera. So there's a lot of people that have to help me do all of these things. And if you think you can do it alone, then I think you're wildly mistaken.
Right. So are you organizing writers' rooms?
Yeah. So for both, I mean, we had writers' rooms for the Dropout and for Plainville, and for Plainville, you know, we had actually a lot of writers from Dr. Death. Again, we don't need to applaud them. It's fine. They're not here. No, I'm just kidding. But they were phenomenally talented writers who had already, you know, I had just come off of the Dropout. I was literally started the writers' room of Plainville in August 2020, and Dropout was supposed to go into production in March 2020. That clearly did not happen. But we all had experience adapting this material. But we also, I think, none of the writers in either the Dropout or Dr. Death and then Plainville were necessarily like true crime writers or like limited series writers. There were people who wrote half-hour comedy. There were people who were playwrights. There were people who had vastly different experiences, which was the most important thing for us, was like, I don't need someone who can directly tell me how this can be adapted for television. I need somebody who's going to interestingly tell me a fever dream of like how this episode of a podcast becomes something fascinating and visual and interesting and character-based. And so that was always our priority, and that was the luckiest thing, I think, for both the Dropout and Plainville, was these amazing writers' rooms filled with writers who weren't solely focused on, like, how do I tell this story? It was, how do I tell this story in a different way?
The thing that happened with Elizabeth Holmes is that there was an actual trial going on while you were writing, right before you were finishing. What did you do then?
I said, so sorry, Liz Merriweather. No, we were supposed to go into production in March 2020, and the show was fully written. And then the pandemic shut everything down. And I went off to make Plainville, and Liz Merriweather who's the showrunner of the show, was running it. And the trial kept getting pushed. And there were a few things, I think, that we probably knew were going to come out at the trial that we had already begun to address in the show. Because we interviewed, both Rebecca Jarvis and her team were always on top of it, but we had interviewed a number of people involved in this story as well, and we'd heard a few things that we thought would come out. And so we had attempted to address it, but then when the deluge of text messages came in from the courtroom, when I think Liz was shooting episode 5 or 6 of 8, that was, I think, a tough day. And I mean, Liz was constantly rewriting on set, and they were shooting actually like really locked down, so Liz wasn't there. She had another one of our writers was on set with her, and but they were constantly adapting. It's with Plainville, I had the text messages before, so that was a little step up. But yeah, I mean, it was a constant adaptation.
Amazing. So Barry, talk a little bit about where are the multiple sources that you look for material now? How many different ones are you going after? And how do you go about finding this stuff? What is the trawling process?
As an obsessed Elizabeth Holmes fan, I must say, I listened to every imaginable podcast, every bit of news when the trial was going on and the podcast would drop. I think on Wednesday mornings, that was the first thing I did every day. So I want to congratulate you, but I want to tell you I'm really jealous.
Thank you.
When I read that the rights went to somebody else, I was horrified. But it's a brilliant show.
So it's a competitive landscape.
Well, I was too busy listening to the podcast to realize that I should have been chasing the rights. Probably involved this guy right here. So I'm going to answer your question 1 second. I just want to digress for one moment because I was
ahead.
thinking, because Jason was talking about the start of his career, and what went through my mind was because what we're with source material and IP, what we're talking about is the origin story for films and television. So my origin story, my very, very first job that directly led to me sitting in this chair, oddly, was started right here. My very first job was in this building right across the way here. It's called the Stars Dressing Room Building. And I spent many, many years here on the Fox lot, sitting in that building, answering phones. We did this thing called typing then. I was explaining this to Jason. There was no whiteout and all this shit. You know, it was a nightmare. Anyway,
Is there a
but
fax
right
machine?
there, and then I would come into this commissary. I was looking, they haven't changed the paint. Because I would go over there to the to-go section and I would order sandwiches for my boss. But again, with the source material, it's interesting because when I had time, I would go over to stage 10 where MASH was shooting. And so MASH was a book that became a movie, that became a television series. And think about it, it was a book about a mobile army hospital in Korea. And by the time it came to a series, again, what was in that book was it was a unique setting in a world with a lot of dynamic energy and really, really compelling characters. So they took that became the basis of what at the time was probably the most successful television show ever. I think its finale was a most watched TV show probably still in the history of television.
I think the finale is still the most watched show ever.
But it was right here, stage 10 on the Fox lot. So how we look and how we find things everywhere and everything. As again, thinking about today, the origin story of A&E Studios, our very first series was Unreal. And Unreal, the way Unreal came to us was it was an AFI short. It was Sarah Gertrude Shapiro's graduate film. I think she was in the directing workshop for women. She made a film called Sequin Rays. And it was a very inspired film about, with the experiences of someone who was like a PA, a producer's assistant, on a show that some people might think was similar to, I don't know, The Bachelor. But someone else looked at it and said, oh my God, that's a TV show. And off we went, and it had its very successful run. I appreciate that you said it was Hulu's Unreal. Some people think it started on Lifetime, but that's when we used to have this thing called linear television. We look everywhere, again, even in the discussion today, and it's so interesting what's going on is because podcasts become TV shows, movies become inspiration for TV shows, books, articles. Some of you may have noticed comic book characters are very popular. So we're really looking everywhere. I think, as things evolve, I mean, again, Jason could probably speak to this better than I can, whether there has been a YouTube video or a YouTube channel that's been turned to television. I'm going to think of something and I'll come up with it later. Or, there's TikTok, Snap, et cetera. See, everything is a form of filmmaking, right? We're creating a world. We're infusing with characters. We're giving it a driving narrative. We're filling it with lots of emotion. And wherever that exists, those of us who are filmmakers find inspiration, or as they might say in the writer's room, a jumping off point, right? Anything that becomes the inspiration for something else is great source material for us to use for adaptation.
Jason, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. I mean, I've sold a Twitter feed, so you can kind of, I guess, find it.
Explain this to me.
Find it anywhere. No, there have been handles that have been Twitter feeds that have then turned into books and film and TV opportunities.
Zola is like the best example it's a Twitter thread that then the movie is
completely
is a Twitter thread.
Yeah. Zola, and then got A24 made some really cute little coffee table books, and but that's exactly right. And people were chasing that, and then Kushner wrote about it, I believe, as well. So so we look everywhere, far and wide, but it's also, I think, incumbent on us as representatives to have our finger on the pulse of the new ways of people putting storytelling out into the universe. So the methods and mediums will kind of change and evolve. But all of these networks and studios need great content to attract their subscribership, as we're all kind of moving to that model as well. So, because of that, we're looking everywhere far and wide, but, really looking for dynamic voices and, stories that we, seem stranger than fiction that we want to, breathe new life into.
Can I just, because I just was thinking, because something that you guys represented, when you think about, what we're talking about, what's going on now in the world is on-demand video, right? And in the origin story of on-demand video, there were these web series, and there's one that UTA represented. It didn't make its way all the way to TV series. I know it was attempted multiple times, which was Lonely Girl.
Yeah.
Right? It was a web series, and people, again, they found this concept of streaming video, and it was a UTA, right? It was a UTA property. It never made its way to TV series, but we're looking in places where that are just emerging media all the time.
I just wanted to jump in because I think like the other thing, and Jason, you just touched upon this, is like looking for voices. I could listen to the same podcast that 7 other showrunners listen to, and it doesn't spark with me, or I know it's competitive, and I'm like, well, I should go after this, but I don't know. And the 6th of those showrunners has an incredible perspective on it and a POV that changes it and makes it takes it to the visual medium. And that can be with a podcast or a book or an article or a Twitter thread or anything like that. Like, I think for Zola, to me, is so interesting because it's such a specific perspective, and then Janiska came in with an even more specific POV and really made this incredibly unique property. And that's, I think, the thing that is really important when you're talking about IP, that it's not just blanketing the world and blanketing film and television with IP. It's coming in with a perspective, with, I think, a strong opinion of what you're going to do. With Plainville, Patrick and I came in with a very strong opinion of how to tell the story, of how we felt about it, of what we wanted an audience to feel with it. And with The Dropout, the tone of that show was an incredibly delicate balancing act every day in the writer's room. And Liz Merriweather knew what it was, and then we all were trying to catch up and make sure we did too. And that, I think, is what is unique about this, is it's not just making IP to make IP. I think it's the teams around it that are bringing it to that next level.
So I guess the other question I have is, you're looking for fresh voices, you're looking for authentic stories, but you're also trying to preserve the original voice of the creator?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you're trying to, well, if not preserve the voice, I mean, it depends, I think, in process.
Figure out how to tell the story.
I mean, talking about origin stories, my origin story is A, shout out to AFI, and then B, I adapted Katharine Graham's life story into the Post, and I didn't really know what I was doing. And I loved Katharine Graham. That was where it started, was I loved her, I admired her, and I felt her story should be out there. And my unique perspective on it was just that I thought she had a coming of age story at 55 years old. And that was what made her unique, and I thought I could make this story unique in that. In adapting that, preserving her voice was by far the most important thing, was that I wanted to make sure that anyone who knew her, her children, anybody who worked with her, when they watched it, that they felt like she was alive on screen, that they felt like the integrity of her voice was there. So I think when you're talking about real people, that for me is the most important thing. And then, a journalist's job is not to go into, Liz Merriweather said this, so I'm stealing it and making it mine. Again, she's not here, so it's fine. But Liz said that, like, it's not a journalist's job to tell the interior life of somebody, of their subject. It's to paint the picture of the full story. And that's our job with The Dropout or Plainville, that was on us. And I think that is a really, an enormous responsibility. And it's preserving the journalist's integrity and making sure that they are proud in the same way that if you're showing a true person, that they are proud.
But I also love to hear that, because I think it's not every producer and showrunner that will actually bring the journalist and author and life right subject like into the conversation in terms of the adaptation. And for in representing a lot of them. I know that it's so meaningful to them in terms of when producers are seeking out IP to go and option and develop, to really, just bring them in and let them have a seat at the table early on in the process is so invaluable for that relationship in the future as well.
Just make sure you tell all your clients when I'm trying to get their material. In a couple
Exactly.
months. Thank you.
Done.
I mean, we feel incredibly fortunate with the showrunners we work with. Everything that Wondery produces on the podcast side, we stay involved as executive producers
see.
on the television side. And we're really obviously there to help guide and shape creative and be a resource. But going back to all of the information that we've compiled, the fact that we have, for Shrink Next Door, which was a story, we had 7+ hours of raw audio from Marty Markowitz and his different interviews and things like that. And that was, very valuable to our showrunner, Georgia Pritchett, on. So I think there's definitely things from the early stages of the podcast and the early stages of the IP that can move on to the television side.
Is there too much true crime?
Well, I did 2 of them, so sorry, guys. That's on me.
Seems to
No,
be. It seems
not
to be
not too
working.
much. It's wildly popular. What we see on at A&E networks or just watching television, true crime in almost any form is popular. Podcasts, unscripted, it's wildly popular. It continues to get viewed at huge numbers, and clearly take true crime as as a basis or source material for scripted is a wonderful gift. There's great drama. Something awful happened. There's a trial sometimes, and there are protagonists and antagonists. It's really wonderfully set up, and people love the playing along with the puzzle solving of it all.
I mean, I also just go back to In Cold Blood. Like, In Cold Blood is the basis of all true crime stories, and that, I mean, if anybody here hasn't read In Cold Blood, they absolutely should, because it's a phenomenal exploration of this crime. But it's everything you just said, Barry, which is like, for me, it's about humanity. It's about people. And I don't know another, at least for me, type of a genre where you're getting the dynamics and the humanity, and you're presented with a moral and ethical conundrum, not just with your characters, but also as a creator. I mean, I think if you're depicting or telling a true crime story, you should be asking yourself every day whether or not you should be making it, because you should be justified in making it, not because it was a competitive piece and somebody's paying you to put it on television. You should be making sure that what you are putting on television is responsible, respectful, and pushing and putting the truth out there, and I think being a storyteller. And so I think true crime does all of those things. I also think, like, are there too many superhero movies?
But Liz,
I will write one. I'm fine with it.
I am curious about putting the truth out there, though, because the truth and because I feel like you guys walked such a delicate line in The Dropout specifically, where you humanized this woman that it's convicted and going to prison, and
you're maybe fictionalizing a bit. Yeah.
And taking some literary license is, you're not there and privy to every single conversation that they're having, but it's impressive to see, and does take a real creative point of view to take that source material and then come up with, how you're going to imbue your own voice, but also, kind of debate with what is truth and what is reality. And
I mean, you're not in every room. You can't be in every room. So you are taking, I think, creative liberties and knowing what conversations happened or didn't happen. But going to this is, and what I was saying before is if I'm not there in the room, so I don't have a document of this conversation happening, but I know that probably this conversation happened, I want the words that are coming out of the mouths of those characters to feel like they sound like them, that there's integrity in their words and in their performance. And I think the finale of The Dropout for me is really fascinating, and it was something that completely changed from when we were in the writer's room, and Liz wrote it before going back into production. And there's a moment at the end of the series, I think Elizabeth Holmes did a number of very bad things, some of which she was convicted for, but the thing that she wasn't convicted for is that she also ruined the lives of every Theranos employee, is that nobody who worked at Theranos is ever going to get a job where the first question isn't, so. And I think the way that that is depicted in that last conversation, in being basically the moral mirror to Elizabeth Holmes and saying, look at Michaela Watkins is in her performance, who Michaela's incredible, and what that happens in that scene, I think, is really quite provocative and quite truthful to who this woman is and her inability to look in the mirror, her inability to accept, what, I mean, she said her dog was a wolf, so I'm done.
I think what Liz is saying is really interesting too, because you look at something like We Crashed, and you have all these events and all these stories from everyone who, worked at the company, was involved as investors, knew everything around. But for our podcast, we didn't interview Adam or Rebecca, yet, we're still able, and our showrunners were able to do all this research, take what we had also, and kind of build the narrative that actually truly existed around their relationship.
So, given the enormous demand for content right now, this explosion, the streaming world, everything, and all these myriad sources that you're finding, are people taking more risks as right now, creatively?
That's such an interesting question. I just want to comment on something Liz said also. As filmmakers, while it is okay to ask yourself every day, why are you making this? Don't ever ask that question of the buyers. So it's interesting.
Touche.
What? Go ahead.
Please, Barry.
Are risks now? No. If anything, I think there's a greater risk aversion. And, for some of the same reasons, again, for the histories of movies and television shows, nobody knows anything. No one really can predict a hit. No one really knows what's going to be the most successful series. And notwithstanding what you may have read, no one thought when they greenlit Squid Game that was going to be the biggest TV show in the world. But, and to the point of this discussion, of this panel, there seems to be, if anything, a greater appetite for source material, for IP, for rights, something that I think gives the buyers confidence that it's been tested, it's been proven, there's a pre-existing audience, there's some sort of marketing hook. And, as these decisions get made nowadays through either committee or bureaucracies, it gives just greater justification and gravitas to the decision to buy something and make it, rather than, I just heard a good idea.
And is the industry going to be continuing at full tilt the way it is now, or is the Netflix diminishment, recent, maybe temporary, going to be a sign of a contraction to come?
Can I just jump in really quick on what Barry said? So I totally agree with you in that I think everyone is terrified and doesn't know what's going on. I think as a writer, I generally feel this way, so welcome everyone to this feeling. I actually am feeling more empowered to take risks as a creator.
Good.
Because of what you're talking about, because no one has any idea what's hitting or why it's hitting, or Squid Game, who knows, so I mean, with Plainville, there's 3 musical numbers, there's 4 different timelines, we tried stuff. And it didn't all work, but we tried it, and we really wanted to go for it because we didn't want to do something we'd seen before, or that even a lot of us had done before. And I think that is really encouraging, and was also encouraging with our collaborators who wanted to do that as well. Elle Fanning, who's the star of Plainville and also an executive producer, she was like, let's go weirder, let's go darker, let's do something different. And there's a shot at the end of episode 7 after she dreams a sequence of Teenage Dirtbag where her sister is in a glee choir, then tormenting her into it, and it turns into a nightmare. So again, there's a moment at the end, which is this take that Elle did. It was the very last take where we were like, do you want to just do something really, really weird? And she did, and it's the take that's in the show, and I think it's absolutely incredible. And so I think it's filtering into everywhere. This kind of this fear and this terror is weirdly freeing, at least in a creator standpoint, because what else are we going to do, you know?
So before we go to questions, which we're about to do, are we heading for a continued surge? Or
I mean,
not to use that
I haven't
word.
felt any let up whatsoever, which I think just speaks to, the demand being high. And there's a lot of musical chairs and disruption going on across the studio landscape, but it's going to settle out, and the new kind of incumbents, have to build their new slate. So, we look at it as opportunity for us to, bring the artists and storytellers that we're representing, into their lives, and filling the blank space, if you will.
I think also that I agree. There's no let up. There's no letting off the gas. There's a lot of there's a big appetite out there, and to Liz's point, where there's that big appetite, there's greater opportunity for creative risk. I think one other thing that we're going to be seeing is more locally originated series from other parts of the world being part of the continuing to grow in the global zeitgeist or the global appetite. Squid Game and Spanish Heist, Berlin, Babylon, Fauda, Tehran, they've all taught us that they've taught us how to watch TV shows that originate in other parts of the world. And while we don't give enough credit to it, technology has been very, very helpful in that process. You literally push a button and you can watch a show any way you want to watch it. You could watch it dubbed in English, you could watch it in the original language with subtitles. There are many other languages. If your preferred language is something else, you could watch it dubbed in Spanish, French, German, etc. So I think we're going to see even more of a surge around exposure to shows that have originated from somewhere else in the world other than North America.
Okay, anybody got a question? You? With the black hat? Sorry, we're running mics around.
Hi, thank you guys so much for taking the time to be a part of this panel and everything. It's really awesome that we chatted about, once you've gotten an IP. But I would love for us to go back and reflect. And first and foremost, my name's Audrey. I'm part of the PGA Create Fellow program with the scripted the scripted cycle as well. So reflecting back on you guys' careers and reflecting back at the time that you were interested in an IP, what is a lesson that you've learned that you still hold on to till today? And what was the situation that happened when you went about acquiring that IP?
I mean, I would say from my vantage point, we read books in manuscript and proposal form so early, and so something that I was kind of had to learn, but I was also told this was to have a point of view, and you have to have conviction from day one. So, for me personally to, read a manuscript that's selling to a publisher, and then we're deciding if we're going to take it on to represent on the film and TV side, you have to see something, feel something in your soul that you gravitate toward it, and then, also want to fight tooth and nail to help bring that piece of intellectual property to life. I would just say have an opinion.
Go ahead. That guy.
So you've got a great IP. Does it have to be a bestseller? Do you have to have millions of audience? Where's the weight you put towards an audience or followers or whatnot when you're looking at an IP?
There's no
Podcast
particular metric or expectation around popularity. I think its existence, its notoriety, and the basic elements are story, character, etc. are really what's appealing and essential in selling, acquiring, etc.
I do think buyers look for that, or look for, is it a bestseller? They try to find, how many, copies it sold on BookScan, but a lot of the time, there's a chase early on for material, and it's my job as a representative to get it out in the world in the right way, and kind of put my producer hat on and see what are the sort of creative elements that are going to make sense to help shepherd the project along as well. But, I think it's also, for us to create the market for it, not necessarily, already being guaranteed a bestseller. But I have seen where someone has optioned something early on and worked really alongside the publisher to really put everything into it so that one feeds into the other as well. Because, for an author, the movie or TV show is just a giant billboard to their book.
I think in the end of the day, is the story translatable? Do you have a passionate creator behind it with a point of view? We've had success in selling podcasts that have spent 25 straight days at #1 on the Apple podcast charts. And we've also sold things that, haven't risen into the top 10, but are phenomenal stories that we know are translatable with great packages built around them. So it can go either way.
To one other point to the prior question, something that Liz reminded me of, when you have an instinct, don't hesitate. Don't wait, don't hesitate, don't think about it. Activate yourself, because, by the time, I got to read about it in Deadline or something, that the Dropout was gone. And we have Lincoln Lawyer on Netflix, and just as an example of the don't hesitate, the TV rights to Michael Connelly's book were controlled by another television studio, and as we're having conversations with David Kelly about what we might want to do together next, David said, David, being a former lawyer, expressed interest in Lincoln Lawyer, so we found out that the rights were controlled by another studio, but were going to be expiring, and I don't know, 2 or 3 months later. So what we did is we constructed a proposal that was submitted, that the email went out at 12:01 a.m. on the day the rights became available, 1 minute after the other rights holders' rights expired. Our proposal was in the hands of the representatives of the book, and by maybe 7:30, 8 a.m. the next morning, we were in exclusive negotiation, and it worked out. We didn't hesitate.
Wow.
Sir, in the front row.
Excuse me in advance. First of all, thanks for this very informative, entertaining panel. Stuart Vlaco here. I want to ask you, and I apologize in advance for this question, which you always get. When do you need the legal, contractual life story rights? I mean, there's a lot of articles, like you said, everything, everywhere, all the time. When you can adapt something that's in the public domain, when is it, I know this is really an aging question. And the second part of that is, how big of an advantage, or how much does it matter if you get the person? Like, if you could really get the person to cooperate, who's the figure involved?
So I, as a writer, I'm constantly terrified of being sued. So I would say get the rights immediately. Now that has that looks a lot of different ways. I wrote the post on spec, did not have the rights. Also, had no concept of that ever being made, because I was like, this is a moral thriller, which, let me tell you, buyers are very excited about. So what it turned into is everybody's like, this is revisionist history. It really wasn't. I mean, I wrote it at my kitchen table. I just wanted an agent. I did not have rights. When Amy Pascal bought it was when we began that conversation of getting life rights. And that was an incredibly important conversation. We would not have been able to make that movie without the help of both the Washington Post, the Graham family, the Bradley family, everybody involved. I just think as writers, you have to protect yourself. So however that looks, that we did not have the rights to the book. It was one of Kay Graham's dying wishes was not to sell the book. So that was not part of it, but it was getting the rights to everybody around. For In Cold Blood, they did not have the rights to In Cold Blood. They had an option to an article, and that was what they based about that story, and that was what they did, and that's how they backed that in. So it really, if things are in the public, there's a variety of different ways, but I really do believe in protecting yourself. And then how much does it matter to have the person involved? With The Dropout, Elizabeth Holmes was not involved. With The Girl from Plainville, Michelle Carter was not involved. I think it's a personal and legal decision by everyone involved, whether or not those people are. It is, I think, if you're a creator, you have to respect the wishes of whomever it is to not be involved. And you also have to understand that this is not a documentary. I wrote a narrative fictional story that is based on Elizabeth Holmes and a narrative fictional story that is based on Michelle Carter and Conrad Roy and Lynn Roy. So those are, and that's what I talk about responsibility. Like, you have to understand your responsibility in doing that, but you also have to, as an audience, and as everyone involved, you have to understand it's not a documentary. So I think protect yourself and be respectful.
Anyone else?
So there's a lot of lawyers in our industry, and a lot of what they direct us to do is all about making their jobs easier for themselves. So I'm not a lawyer, but here's the general thoughts behind it are you want to have the rights for the benefit of avoiding lawsuits, as Liz said. There are a lot of insurance implications in your production. The more rights you have, the lower your insurance premiums will be. So there are definitely business justifications. The best time to have the rights are either at the point of sale or no later than the start of production. There are, however, there are many, many different means of producing films, television, etc., without having life rights. That requires a lot of annotation, a lot of work from the writers and the writers team in documenting this quote actually happened, this event actually happened because it's already been written about in newspapers and other periodicals, that sort of thing. So the general answer to your question is ideally you have it before you sell it or before you start production.
But the idea of life story rights is it is essentially a waiver to protect yourself from getting sued for defamation. So, you know, we a lot of the time will represent pieces of journalism that don't necessarily have the life rights subject on board. Some of the time it's gray area as to whether they are considered a public figure, which is, you know, protects you somewhat from, you know, getting from that sort of lawsuit. But I would say consult a lawyer. But I think for the ones that are very singular about specific people, you know, for example, one of our colleagues sold or made a deal for the female subjects in The Tinder Swindler that became the basis and intellectual property for that successful documentary that they're now gonna, you know, make a feature film out of as well. It sounds like. So, you know, that was a very specific, you know, that you know, you needed those women's, you know, cooperation and collaboration, you know, into what that specific story was.
Thank you guys for this incredibly helpful, upbeat, cheerful, optimistic panel. I think we all needed that. And thank you for coming to the Produced By conference. It was a wonderful weekend, and come back next year.